Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Tuesday Train Lobby with the 2MK team. As always, Tuesday means Guilty Gear time. If you want to join our lobby and get some experience, this is a loser stays on lobby on the US East Coast. The information on how to join it, i.e. the password and room ID, should be in both the stream title and the tweet that we sent out on our Twitter account 2_MK_FGC. Today we're dealing with chip stuff. There are two ways generally expected and agreed on by most Guilty Gear design and community of how you play this character. If you go on Dustboot, they'll give you a basic breakdown of why he works particular ways, but he's very difficult to play for most people. The reason is not because he isn't that good of a character, but because he's a relatively inconsistent character by most standards. I'll get into that and what that means as we go forward more. The easiest way to understand playing defense against Chip is this: attack the air and stay in the air. Not because Chip has no good air attacks, he has tons of those, but because Chip's tracking is not that great. The second way you deal with him is that whenever you have advantage from knocking him down at all, get close, hit buttons. Not too close though, because too close you get hit by this. You have to be willing to take a certain amount of damage to keep Chip from overusing his mobility to defeat you. So the first thing you should understand is this move is nearly full screen and does nearly no damage. Once you are past the fact that Chip can actually hurt you with that move, namely recognizing that he functionally doesn't, you can start to think of a proper plan. If you think too much about, I'm getting hit by Alpha Blade, you'll start to worry about it, you'll start to overthink the match, you'll lose because the Chip player will have managed to get you into a bad mental state. The reason Chip is generally so hard to play is a combination of three factors that are relatively easy to take advantage of when you're facing a beginner Chip, but is not in any way easy to take advantage of when you're facing an expert. The first thing will be demonstrated in this match more so. The Jackal match is a little bit too frenetic for me to explain all of the details, so I'll mostly play through those and explain while in the Kai matchup. The first thing to understand is that for his big damage, Chip's combos are actually fairly hard. He makes up for this by having few necessities for his Roman cancels, that command grab, and really hard hitting supers. But your main goal, in terms of dealing with him, is to understand that he doesn't actually want to get in on you most of the time. Chip can be played very rushed down, extremely rushed down, but he doesn't actually try to get in on you. Chip needs to generally knock you down first, or do this. Aside from that, as much as he has all the mobility, you probably have control of the spacing in the matchup. You are much freer to move than you would normally think would be possible against a character this fast, but you are also not really able to stop Chip from getting to move himself. So if you learn to respect that motion that Chip has, and don't hit a lot of buttons because he's rushing you down, well, he gets to rush you down. The idea that you can stop Chip from getting to where he wants to be on the screen is a fallacy, and you will die for trying. That is not the important thing. The important thing is to understand that Chip's offense, regardless of anything else you think is happening, Chip's offense is relatively bad. Chip doesn't open you up. Chip makes you hit buttons and then punishes those buttons. Chip's whiff punishes are incredibly good, and Chip's baits are even better, but if you think about what can this character do in neutral to make my life miserable that I can't react to, the answer is basically nothing. You could block probably all of this. He's testing more so your reactions and ability to defend from relatively slow stuff than he is putting you under actual pressure. He is more so a close-in character than a pressure character. In fact, his pressure is actually terrible. Most of his attacks on your knockdown are only mid-tier. His throw leads to stuff, but not to too much, and doesn't buy him a lot of time. He can keep you in a state where you keep getting hit for a while, but the damage scales super hard. And all of these things are relatively hard to execute on top of that. Many of Chip's combos also don't work if you're not in the right position for them. So, the player has, on top of the execution difficulty of getting most of his damage, which involves a bunch of relatively complex jump installs, or finishing with moves that obviously don't do as much damage, you don't really have a lot of fear in terms of dying before Chip does. His defense is terrible. And you mostly lose because you are trying to do something about it when it's not your turn yet. But note I say yet. The reason Chip does not count as a good pressure character is because yet is almost always the way to think about it. Eventually, Chip will run out. What he's counting on is that you have to block for a long period so as not to get caught in his stuff, and that will let him build up your risk meter, find that counter hit, and tear away your health through that. That is a good positioning of minions for that windpose. In the Jackal-Kai matchup, however, it's a lot simpler to play this out, because while Kai does have the same whiff punish capacity, Kai has to move backward. Kai doesn't have other options. The difference between Kai and Chip, for example, is that Kai cannot control the position he's in as well, but he can absolutely whiff punish you well if you stick out too many buttons. In both cases, you should generally not stick out a lot of buttons, but in Kai's case, once he's at a wrong spacing, you know he's going to backdash probably. Take the opportunities for when Kai backdashes to do whatever you feel like doing. It's not necessarily something that will hurt him, but there are quite a lot of things in this game with actions characters can take that are beneficial to them that aren't really dependent on trying to hit Kai. Understanding that Kai wants to backdash from a lot of spaces, but you can't really punish him, gives you an idea of when you should try to just relax yourself and find something else to do with your time. Chip, on the other hand, has a really bad backdash, which would be surprising if you didn't understand much about how the character was designed for the sake of fairness. Chip's backdash is bad, and as a result, he's not going to use it that much. But he will get away from you in other ways, mainly teleports, getting out of things, and so on. It's because his backdash is bad, and I'll repeat this quite a lot throughout our stream, it's because his backdash is bad that the act of attacking Chip on his wake up or after a scramble is a good idea. He does have some invincibility, but Chip's invincible move is very short range. If you have long pokes, he has to catch you with the hit rather than anything else. So, with those basic principles in mind, I hope I can dispel some of the things that make Chip seem scary. Start from the perspective that Chip is not actually scary. He can't get away from you on Wake Up because the teleport takes too long. He can't get away from you in most scrambles where you have managed to get the advantage but can't continue, and you get to keep your attack up. Or he'll just do his uppercut, which you could bait. But he's really good at whiff punishing with a ton of things, and you can't stop him from being where he wants to be on the screen very easily, except on the aforementioned scramble wake-up situation where you get to hit him for trying pretty much anything. Which means that most of the time, your concept of how to deal with Chip should not involve trying to hit him. That's the key to his power. Once you have got him down, go for it. But in neutral, find another way to get an advantage, because if you try anything, most of the time, Chip is going to mess you up. He has tons of ways to do it. And a lot of them work on reaction. However, you can throw out some free buttons to get stuff, or you can move really far away because the way Chip's teleports work, they are either all reactable because he's going right over your head, behind you usually, like that, or he won't actually appear too close to you if he was too far away. The key, therefore, since he has a lot of good cross-ups and you have very little control over them, similar to how Jam does certain things, is that you just don't get to do what you want. The final key to the puzzle, therefore, is you can actually backdash out of a lot of stuff. And backdashing out of Chip's teleports is a good way to deal with him, because it removes the fear of cross-up, and it removes a lot of the threat of his jumping normals. Air backdash is equally effective, which is why it ties into the idea that you should stay in the air. His air normals, while good, are not very long range. So you can't stop Chip from moving, but Chip can't stop you either. He's counting almost completely on this ability. The fact that he can do Alpha Blade to react to a ton of stuff. And from the other side, the fact that if you want to stay close and stay quiet on the ground, he'll grab you and stab you in the face. If you think about the game plan that results from all of these, it's a little counterintuitive given how we play most of the rest of the game. Therefore, both Kai and Jack-O are relatively advantaged in the lower tiers of this matchup. The problems for them appear when Chip has learned the player's rhythm enough to land his standing dust, which is extremely long range, leads to next to nothing, but it's really good range, and manipulating the air movement to get enough hits off of aerial Alpha Blade. The idea basically being that Chip knows the opposing player can't take a lot of actions. They can't afford to do a ton of things. They want to hit buttons to keep him out, to set up things, but unless they are not at the same height as him in the match for regularly long periods of time, they'll mostly end up blocking that. And if his spacing is correct, you can't get away from it. The best you can do is not get hit, but that will not help you because Chip then will never get hit by you either. It's relatively easy to do well in this matchup, especially against twitchier players, by just abusing that move. Because, as I pointed out, Chip is based on the idea that you will want to hit him and that you'll be wrong. He will whiff punish you all the time. You must therefore learn whether or not the Chip player is trying to play ground or air at any given time. And if he is trying to go into the air all the time, stay on the ground. You don't always have to block even, but you should probably, because he can do Alpha Blade so late in his jump that it might as well be a grounded move. But note again, most important, it's frustrating, but he's intended to be frustrating. It's not that damaging. It will take forever to die off Alpha Blade alone. Understanding when your opponent wants to do that, and the fact that your forward P gives some upper body invincibility, helps a lot. Being able to put certain types of barrier up in front of your face, or attack Chip quickly by either putting out hazards or anticipating him with very long moves that cover the space in the middle top of the screen, can shut down that part of his strategy. But he does still have others, and he will use them. Again, you must remember, you cannot really stop Chip from getting to where he wants to be, or doing what he wants to do. The key is that you don't get hurt that much by him doing it until you start to stick out buttons. Jack-O in particular, therefore, can cover a lot of her own position by putting down her S-house first and trying to level it up as much as possible. Chip spends so much time moving around in other spacings that he can't damage her houses as easily as most characters can without opening himself up to stuff. One can apply the same style of fighting against Chip as against Kai, just with different normals. Against Chip, if you have any normals that hit high middle of the screen, aim for those. If you have any that hit low middle of the screen against Kai, aim for those. Kai's tendency to dash means that he's often out of the range of things that would be able to punish your middle lows, and often vulnerable to standing dust when he refuses to back off. Jack-O's benefit in this matchup is that it's not really a matchup by most standards. Once houses are down, Jack-O can either make sure that she is blocking so that when Chip does Alpha Blade, he does not damage the houses, and that's basically it. Or she can aim to attack the space he would have to jump up into before doing it. His other mobility, I'll note for example that Chip has a higher jump than most characters in the game. And a triple jump if he really wanted to get higher. But once Jack-O's houses are up, while Chip can attack and make the minions disappear, if Jack-O is blocking and just not bothering to do anything, it's almost impossible to do anything to them. And Alpha Blade's low damage does not only apply to Jack-O. The amount of time it takes for him to take care of houses with Alpha Blade alone is much higher than you'd expect. Plus he can always be baited into having them explode in his face like that. The S-House entities are able to launch various attacks with little beams that make it even more difficult for Chip to move about freely. So he has to surgically aim for Jack-O with teleports. But since she has so many good anti-air methods for making sure that she doesn't get clipped by those, and decent mobility of her own, you have to be very focused on her position in order to make sure you hit her. But once you are put into a situation where you want to hit more things, and the Chip player has a good idea of how you want to move regarding those things, you'll get hit a lot. And have to focus so much on putting him in bad situations that you won't really have a lot of time to deal with the defense part of the matchup. But note also that Chip cannot teleport in the air. And once the S-House is off, he can't use wall climb or particularly effectively use all of his teleports unless you move away from your minions. Jack-O's aim, therefore, is to stay as close to her minions as possible. This is a matchup in which she just leads her army into battle simply because if she does not get hit, they will just keep on building up and Chip can't do that much. On the other hand, this playstyle can be really frustrating because the only thing Jack-O can do is wait for things to settle down. And keeping yourself out of everything Chip can do, given all of his other weaknesses, obviously he would be a terrible character if that was too easy to do. Pushing yourself to land damage on Chip is the way to lose. Pushing yourself to land damage on Kai at max range is also a way to lose. Consider what your character can do that is advantageous to them in any way, because Guilty Gear characters have a lot of little extra mechanics they can use to build up meters and advantages of various kinds. Think about what your character can do that's even just putting a defense wall in front of you like Kai's Grinder. What can you do when the opponent isn't ready to attack you yet, but you can't stop them from moving? You can't land your attack, but it's still your turn. It's your turn, but not your turn to attack. What else do you have that you can use? The other thing it allows you to do, sometimes, is literally just whiff moves for meter. Against Kai, this is terrifying for Jacko, because even if she doesn't use a long move, as long as she uses one of her moves that does not in fact cost her any meter, she can just whiff them. Jacko is at heavy advantage because she has so many good options for things she can do that are to her advantage while Kai is doing his little retreating and respacing. Understanding where to take the character from there and when it is best for you to put forth your energy to actually make an attack is hard, but against both Chip and Kai, the answer is generally to be more patient. You don't have to rush to gain that victory against them. You can push forward on them to see if you can make them retreat more, but for the most part, you don't have to do anything. You have to be able to enjoy a certain amount of frustrating, slower play with Jacko to make this really work for you against Kai, but it's mostly how Jacko players generally function, so if you really enjoy the character, it won't be too difficult for you to do this. Pay attention to when you take damage, because it will almost always be because you are moving forward. The idea that Kai, as a generality, is going to open you up when you are playing Jacko is unlikely, to say the least. Because none of Kai's positions lead to Jacko getting opened up by very much. And once she has enough awareness of her minions and just follows the attack vector that they aren't currently covering, Kai gets locked down and can't do that much. But as you can see there, going for a finishing attack reset the situation and Kai got to do something. You have to be a person who is completely willing to frustrate and stress someone else to win this particular matchup. Kai is normally the one that gets to do all that frustrating, but Jacko can totally be more frustrating than Kai. Woman is, after all, a walking siege engine. Moments like that, where you are taken by surprise by the Kai player going for something large and unsafe, should not be considered representations of the main issues in the match. You'll note that while Kai is managing to do some damage with those moves, It's not enough to deter Jackal from doing anything, and it's normally not damaging houses until after. Sometimes it's not even damaging them after, depending on where the houses were on the screen. But situations like that, where Jackal went for pressure on a knockdown, led to Kai getting his feet again. There's very little reason for her to do this. In fact, the faster she tries to put down the house or use her mobility to deal with the knockdown situation, the better she will play in this match. Deciding whether or not to go for the knockdown is a hesitation that is long enough to make house placement punishable. You have to intend to place the house before anything else in order to make it through here. The same does not necessarily apply to Chip. As noted before, Chip is the one that Jackal actually wants to attack on Wake Up, not because Chip can't block, but because Chip gets no benefits from blocking the way Kai will. It's also generally more difficult for Chip to destroy houses in the first place, so it's more likely that Jackal will have minions up at the point of the knockdown. So let's see if we can watch that play out now, at least in terms of knockdown pressure, wake up pressure, and so on. Because Jackal is another character that does not have to get close to Chip to put some pressure on him. But I'm going to wake up with his uppercut whenever I can, then we'll see how it interacts. As you can see, unlike Kai, who has a ton of stuff to cover all that space, where Jackal just goes into the air and kind of floats there and puts up pressure that way, Chip lacks a lot of that. And Jackal's guards are good at stopping teleports from being dangerous. Thinking too much about the match and therefore not letting yourself play your defense game is generally the way that Chip will wear you down. But please note also that Alpha Blade is not a low, so you're really not in that much danger at any point. The thing you need to fear in that situation is this move, not this one. But there you see all the space that Jacko's guards and her general attacks allow her to cover. The problem being that whenever she lands from a scramble, she's more likely to try to hit a button and get hurt. Fighting chip is a mental state that one can build up relatively easily over time, because it's actually supposed to be the opposite of how the character makes you feel when you don't understand it. You need to fight chip as relaxed as possible and understand that mobility and speed do not come with a bunch of mix-ups in most situations. There are definitely mix-ups, but they don't necessarily lead to a lot of damage without extremely good execution and very high awareness. And by the time you face a chip that has both those things, you probably have worked out enough of the rest of the matchup from playing that way that you don't have to worry about it anymore. The other main difference between the Kai and Chip matchups for Jacko is that against Kai, when she wants to get away, she can almost always safely air backdash. Kai is really bad at hitting that space, whereas Chip doesn't have anywhere near as much problems doing it. Even if Chip does not hit it, he has a lot of ways to make sure that she'll be in a bad position when she lands. Jacko's ability to force a float on herself and to have her minions out in front of her to prevent a lot of Kai just following her in as quickly as possible means that she gets to spend a lot more time air backdashing out of problems than Chip does. Similarly, she has a lot of moves that are good distance mix-ups with her standing dust. Kai has many reasons to stay in positions where he doesn't want to hold back to move backward at all. And this means that Jao is able to hit standing dust on a lot of his punish situations, because if he moved back at all, he would put himself in a different spacing, he would open himself up to her lows, and he would not easily be able to make sure that the spacing for punishing her on air backdash or similar were correct. So tons and tons of free standing dust. Same as with Ino, really. There's just too many things for Kai to worry about in neutral after certain attacks of his own that get blocked, for him to actually be safe walking back and not being hit by those. If your character's lows weren't so good or didn't lead to much or didn't help, then a problem. But that does not happen against Jackal. Jackal's lows knock you down, and she has good positioning in the air to prevent any other problems. Now here's a matchup we haven't seen before. Johnny's ability to put large attacks at basically any spot on the screen means that Jackal's positioning is more important than anything else. She needs to stand at approximately mid-screen and do nothing. Because it's super important in this match that Jackal does very little. For Johnny to be effective, he must put himself in the spacing of a ton of her minions and cannot necessarily get away from them. His moves are also relatively long and slow, so he has to take a lot of forward movement to make sure that he isn't actually doing anything. But once she has that position, Johnny's block strings put him at a space where he doesn't get to do much if Jackal retaliates. She just has to be aware of him coming forward to hit him with just anything, literally standing, dust, like kick, punch, whatever. Anything whatsoever that she does when he moves forward is usually effective. And beyond that, waiting for him to finish a move and then do very little sets her up for easy-ish victories. The problem comes when Jackal again doesn't want to stay on defense. Any attempts to react to Johnny's far range dashes, for example, lead to situations like that. He will clip her before she can actually react to anything he does anyway. So it's just pointless. Let him run the gauntlet, because most of his moves are too slow, and he has to try to target her very specifically when he's moving. Therefore, she can jump out of stuff, air backdash, react to things, set up situations. She has a ton of options in these situations that Johnny just can't deal with outright. But counter-attacking him often leads to very bad situations for her. Johnny's coins are his way out of this situation. But as we all know, our Jackal player is very stubborn, so she will keep on going in even though it's really not necessary. So in the case of Chip, it comes down to her willingness to throw out that long wrecking ball over her head and how much damage she will take from Alpha Blade during that time. But as you can see, Rift punishing with Chip is so trivial and so relatively damaging. Note that the move does a ton more damage when it is hitting someone in recovery than otherwise. Now there's really no stress on Chip's side. It's easy to jump out of Chip's stuff and easy to lock him down, but if you decide to do something, you're going to be in a lot more danger. As you can see, that move also stops the Alpha Blade on the way in. So it's not as if Jacko does not have a strong defense, it's that it also gets beaten by stuff relative to teleports. Understanding the mentality of the opposing chip is more important than anything else. The Axel Chip matchup is actually really easy for Chip because Axel is whiff punishable at certain ranges very well and can't really stop Chip from teleporting. He also has no very strong quick reactions to Alpha Blades, so he has to rely on the fact that Chip doesn't get any OP off them or much damage at all. If your spacing is off though, then you get yourself back into that situation where Axel has blocked you correctly, managed to get the hit on the wake up or whatever, and now can just hit buttons until Chip has to stop moving. The key is to not really fear Chip on Wake Up. Axel does have some good Wake Up options in the first place, so it's not really as if he's really in danger. But, just like any other character, the idea of stopping Chip from playing neutral the way he wants to is not really what you're trying to do. Chip is going to be twitchy and trying to get into position all the time. So you just have to mostly let him. This goes against the way that most people normally play Axel. No, Axel is normally trying to hold the position and keep space so that the opponent can't get to a space that they want to. But he actually can't stop Chip from doing this. At best, he can make it uncomfortable for you to try. And going into the air obviously does help somewhat. But actually holding him off is much more a matter of recognizing where Chip is and the most likely thing that Chip will try to do to get in, if he's going to try at all. Because unlike most characters who don't have up, forward, diagonal attack vectors to easily shut Chip down when he tries to do other things, like jump into the air to do the Alpha Blade from there, or throw his shuriken, Axel is uniquely powerful in this setup. And therefore, Chip's good ideas get limited a lot more. Axel can stay on the ground and attack. And when he sees Chip coming at him, just jump back. There's nothing that Chip can do. Once he's at mid-range or so, he's probably going to miss. There's some difficult execution you can do with instant air alpha blades, but even those won't necessarily work because of Axel's ability to float if he really wants to. This is actually something that Kai has to deal with far more than Axel. Because making Kai react to instant air alpha blades is terrifyingly dangerous to this character. And tricking him by doing certain other things just opens him up for teleports eventually because he doesn't want to stand still. Kai is also often tempted to stick out buttons to prevent Chip from moving in, but because you can never tell what exactly Chip's movement is, this is not very helpful to him. And because when Chip does move in, Kai really doesn't get to recover in time to get away from some of his stuff. Kai's best defense is always those. Just put grinders, always. Just leave grinders everywhere. You'll get hit still, but the times you get hit will change. And when the times you are hit change, the matchup changes. Because this particular minefield is one that Chip can navigate, but as soon as you've placed one, it's either going to stop him from coming in on you very quickly, forcing him to delay certain things like that, or give you a free attack that he has to get out of the way of. Even there, for example, it's iffy because it probably would have traded, but most likely the grinder was the answer and not the whatever it was that was actually done. You don't know. Chip was far away and you couldn't tell exactly what was going to happen. The obvious answer is to stick out your longest button. But most of the grinders would at least make Chip trade with anything Kai did. While you can functionally RRC Alpha Blade, it is a lot of effort to do very little. You probably want to do it on teleports instead, which is basically his freest mix-up, but it's again based on the idea that the opponent is thinking about how to anti-air it, how to stop it, how to make sure that Chip is punished for doing it. You mostly get hurt when you force yourself to do that. When you are just trying to stop him from getting in, you don't really manage that much. He gets to get in by using meter, but it's a lot of meter to get in. It's not a winning strategy when you don't have the execution yet with Chip to maximize the damage you get off that. So with Punish, Runaway Chip is less likely to use it for that, and more likely to just save it for big damage on with Punish supers. Now, as mentioned, this is a matchup we don't see very often, but this is actually very similar to how the Chip matchup is taken in for Kai. Because of the interaction that Johnny has with most grinders and his excellent range for keeping Kai out of position, Kai's best defense is grinder itself. If you think about how Kai has ever managed to get in on Johnny, it has never been by actually fighting outright. It's almost always a matter of throwing out the fireball in close range or hitting grinder in scrambles and unfamiliar situations. Attempting to play footsies with Johnny is basically the same as trying to play footsies with Dawson in Street Fighter. Don't do it. While Johnny does have good attacks for low, forward, and high, much like this sort of character in general, he's slow enough that he has to relatively predict which one to use. Your suffering comes from when you don't believe that Johnny will make a mistake ever. If you believe that Johnny will just beat you at that point, no matter what you do, that the player will always be prepared for any motion, you've shortchanged yourself, because if you are spaced correctly, if you jump and Johnny reacts too early, he won't necessarily hit you. If Johnny reacts too late because he thought you were going to come forward on the ground, again, he won't necessarily hit you. Especially if he was going for the low because you were attacking in some other way. You have to be willing to trust that when you attack him, if you can stay patient long enough that he can't predict you easily, that he will miss. And of course, top tier Johnny will maximize whenever they get the hit, making you even less likely to want to do it. But from the perspective of emotion, you must try to believe that you will get through enough times to get the life lead, to hold on to it, to make Johnny the one that is nervous. From Johnny's side, it's relatively easy to make Kai miserable because Kai is a player who often tries to backdash out of things, and Johnny is one of the few players that can immediately reach him. Which means that when Kai is on defense, Johnny has all control of the neutral spacing. Which is obviously a terrifying and unsettling prospect to Kai players. But there's nothing they can do about it, for the most part. So Johnny should absolutely take as much advantage of that as possible. Kai wants to backdash because he can't play neutral anyway, at least not safely. And Johnny can hurt him for it, unlike most characters who don't get to hurt him, but only get to take some advantage from it. The ultimate timer scam. The other ultimate timer scam is blitzing at that moment. On a higher psychological level, you should note that because Kai needs to respace himself constantly, Even when he gets pressure in the corner, you can usually get yourself back out because muscle memory alone will cause most mid-level Kai players to backdash or walk back. So give yourself a little time to see if you can get the Kai to do that. By riffing 1 or 2 buttons maybe, nothing you're actually trying to hit with, just to make him move. This is true of all characters, but Jackal manages particularly well because of her ability to jump straight up and do a downward attack that can clip him. She cannot easily reverse the situation to put him in the corner, like some characters can. But she can definitely worry less about it and definitely spend less time trying to get an advantage on it. If you're absolutely certain that he will do it, that's your other answer right there. If you think the attack is coming, blitz so that you can push him out, and if you're successful, most of the time he'll just go flying. If you realize that your blitz is not keeping Kai out because it's hitting from too far, then reconsider whether or not you needed to use it at all because he probably moved back to a space where you could have let him keep walking. As the Kai player becomes more and more experienced, they'll recognize which response they need to have to which house based on which Jackal attack is most likely to complement the houses. For example, in this case, when S house is strong, Kai knows that Jackal is probably going for lows, and therefore is more likely to use Greed Sever in those situations. This is compounded by the fact that Jackal doesn't really have a whole lot of good answers to that. The only thing she can do that is particularly useful is to go into the air with her minion and try to set up an attack from there. It does not tend to work out in terms of opening Kai up. But if your goal is to open Kai up, you need more than S house. Now here's a much more familiar matchup. We've seen it many times over the last couple of weeks. And both players have been advancing the way they play it bit by bit. But with his new cancelable crouch heavy, Axel has a much stronger capacity to destroy houses while Jackal is on defense than before. Jackal therefore has to spend more time in the air, and therefore Axel gets to use a lot more of his anti-air style normals. This forces Jackal to make more use of the fact that her jump is relatively high for most of the cast. It's that her second jump isn't. And that's important to understanding how to play it out. Her first jump is decently high, her second jump is not. One of her best ways to take advantage of this is to force Axel to try to spend his time anti-airing her by jumping up and forward and then jumping straight up or backdashing. Because the more time she can cause Axel to spend whiffing anti-air attacks, the longer it takes for houses to be destroyed. And since Axel's general game plan is not to move forward against Jackal, in fact, if she's jumping, he generally can't do that very safely. She can whiff punish his attempts to destroy the houses at least somewhat, while still being safe from a lot of things. He simply can't afford to rush in and try to destroy the houses while she is in that spacing. And, you see here, once enough minions are out to help, the situation just becomes untenable for him. Now, it would seem that it would be easier to therefore go into the air as Axel, but then you're just leaving the houses completely alone. And while he's in much less danger flying around the place, eventually Jackal will build back up one of her minion spells, let's call them that for now, and cause him a lot of problems. Finally, of course, note that when she does do those things, she can block in the air, forcing Axel to do things like this and use up meter to even make it closer to finishing her off. Fortunately, it is still enough, and Axel does build up enough meter to go for that big killing moment. If he finds himself without it though, there may be some dire consequences. But as you can see here, it is relatively easy to make Axel whiff moves against Jackal or do very little damage. The difficulty is in getting the houses in position before she starts this process. It's also a good thing for holding a very specific position on the screen, much like this, where she can count on minions to eventually come in behind her, well, behind the enemy, and solve her problems. Overall though, Axel has the advantage in this situation where the houses are behind him. He simply has too many more opportunities to damage Jackal and move forward slowly, and the chances of him actually getting hit by any of the minions as a result is relatively small. Jackal cannot take the same approach against Johnny because Johnny can delay his higher attack until he can confirm where she is in the air. But again, it's not really necessary because he can't get into positions that are advantageous to him in the first place. And he takes relatively long to destroy houses if she has good motion advantage. He will eventually push himself out and let her put houses down, which in itself becomes a new style of mix-up. She can either put down the house or advance, and he can't defend against both very easily. But a full frontal attack like that is basically just playing into the defensive half of Johnny's playstyle. Much like Chip, if you watch carefully, Johnny really can't destroy houses that quickly. At least not without opening himself up for a lot of Jacko's stuff. So what you're looking for, generally from Jacko's side, is that moment, where Johnny has to use meter just to speed himself up enough to get in with his dash and make her life miserable. But as you can see, once she keeps quiet long enough and takes the chances at the end of his attacks to place houses, she really isn't in much danger. It comes down to understanding how to block coins and understanding that Johnny opening you up is not a thing that generally happens in this game. It's why his combos are so good. He can convert well in neutral, but if you really have a game plan that doesn't involve attacking him ever, you're probably fine. For example, we can note that whenever Johnny hits with that mid-strike, Jacko is at space to put a house down. He has to throw out a coin to make this impossible. But if Jacko decides, it's my turn now, I'm attacking you, she will die, because Johnny is automatically prepared and at the optimal range for anything he wants to do. But once again, don't play footsies with Johnny, it's terrible. Obviously, I won't have much to say about this matchup at the moment. We know how this goes. Lots of grinders, lots of spacing, lots of standing dust.
全土領土最色権利何をやってますげってのは勝つ喜びより負ける楽観の方が大きそうだメンゴ
So, since Johnny can do what he wants and Kai doesn't get to change his own spacing, Kai depends almost entirely on the fact that Johnny's moves for controlling space are slower than most. Well, relatively. For the amount of space they're controlled, they're probably perfectly fine. But it just opens up a lot more options for Kai to do stuff because he doesn't really need to advance. He can slide and do grinder and that be about it. Because Johnny also doesn't deal that well with Kai's fireballs. But he does punish a lot of things that most people can't punish relative to Kai, so it's hard to use your autopilot against Johnny and expect to get away from things. You have to develop an entire autopilot for just putting grinder up all of the time. Johnny's approaches are also relatively linear and he doesn't have any good pass-through moves or attacks. He has to dash for them. But this effort here, which is basically trying to hit him, to play footsies, to reposition yourself, all of those things are autopilots that Kai players normally use that don't work on this character. You have to put grinder up and you have to stop trying to play footsies. Because, similar to Chip, making sure Johnny can't do anything is super difficult. Putting him where you want him, relatively easy. But we can see that our Kai player is not used to this, because nearly every attack that is normally safe is being punished. Nearly every head-on assault that is normally safe-ish pressure is being counter-attacked. And how to deal with all this is probably just overwhelming at this point. Part of the reason for playing these sorts of lobbies, therefore, is to make sure that that doesn't happen to you. That you are not taken off guard by some matchup in a tournament or even just at a local and get destroyed without being able to do anything. From Johnny's side, it's much more a matter of understanding how to conserve coins and noticing when your stray hit is likely to lead to you getting a lot of damage. When things have gone in your favor and it's time to unleash all of Johnny's power, all of that built up meter, levels of misfiner, whatever it is to maximize the damage so that you don't have to sit through a whole set of Kai grinder stuff. matchup is very similar in that Kai has to understand when the advantageous range for himself has happened, not when plus or minus has happened. Because Axel's options are so limited at Kai's advantageous range that he's either going to sit quietly and let you do what you want, or do exactly one move. It seems strange to say that given that Axel has all that range, but the things that would actually lead to him doing anything effective are really limited at about that spacing right there. Similar to the Ino situation, there's just too many ways for the attacker to get through Axel. It's much like playing Sin versus Axel. You know that your opponent is going to suffer much more than you if you guess right at that spacing. That's why it's advantageous to you. It's not that you have no chance of guessing wrong, but your opponent's chances of capitalizing strongly off your wrong guess are pretty tiny. So since the only thing he can do is those aerial hook forward style moves, you can choose one of your many decent options with Kai for dealing with those moves. Hopefully to put him back at the same situation at which you are heavily advantaged. As you can see there, you can be fairly sure he wasn't going to move forward because there isn't a good move forward option for Axel there that Kai can't deal with. Part of the reason the air grinder works so well, in fact, is because at that disadvantaged range, that is the space that Axel is most likely to occupy if he intends to actually attack. Therefore, throwing it out leaves him with literally no options at all. Kai is in the air, Axel has one good poke that will do anything to him, and no ways in. Normally he doesn't care about getting in, but Kai is a character who can hold the life lead against Axel far better than most can. Understanding fighting games is mostly about understanding that your character's tools, especially in the more complex or high-level games, are used completely differently in different matchups. Sometimes they're used much less, sometimes their purposes in the matchup change entirely, sometimes the goals that you start with when you want to use them change. This difficulty in remembering all these different styles of play is effectively the puzzle. A good example is that the grinder does nothing in this matchup because Ino doesn't care about it. Any time Kai spends putting that up is effectively wasted time. But coming off one match with a character against whom you are supposed to do it constantly, into a match against a character where everything else is a better idea, can throw you off. Until you learn to focus your state to view a particular enemy in a particular way and connect the way you should be playing your character, even within your own style, to that particular opponent, you're going to find yourself getting thrown off and pressured because you will not be doing the right thing, and sadly, for most people, bad autopilot just leads to more bad autopilot. But that's why we play so much most of the time and why we work so hard on so many games. Ino and Johnny are the characters most capable of fighting each other at a fair, let's call it fair 50-50, in the middle of the screen. But the way this is done changes quite heavily depending on the meter available to the characters. Ino does not have a lot of really good ways through Johnny's defense, but she has a lot of decent ways around it. Understanding this helps a lot when she has to play in the corner like this, or when she has to defend herself. There's a lot of guts involved here. Understanding that approaching Johnny is fine, attacking Johnny while approaching him is bad. It's similar to the thing I've mentioned before about Jam and Potemkin. Jam becomes infinitely less effective against Potemkin by trying to open him up. Ino can absolutely handle Johnny if she tries to get close to him without actually hurting him, and then worries about the rest of it from there. This is because Ino's buttons are faster and more likely to lead to big confirmed damage. Once she is in position. So it's mostly just a matter of getting over his head. But attempting to attack once she does that will normally get her caught by something he does, or encourage the player to move out of the way, leading to a result much like that. Johnny can either respond to this really early, or use up quite a few coins to get the situation in his favor. Unlike most matchups where using up his coins that early would be bad, because he needs them for pressure, he doesn't really need this against Ino because she also has slow moves and is relatively easy to keep up combos or pressure on without actually needing to use the coins for pressure. By contrast, Axel is the character that Ino does attack when she approaches. Not because he can't stop her, but because the chances that she'll eventually open him up by doing it are actually higher than, let's say, 5%. Against Johnny, you can get pretty close to 5%. The primary reason for this is, when Axel leaps into the air, he has to immediately choose between doing a forward aerial attack and a downward aerial attack. Ino, in turn, can decide whether or not to do her own forward or downward attack. And Ino's hurt more. Therefore, Axel's best interest in that situation is usually to just block and do nothing. He can push her back out if he needs to. But different tricks will then allow Ino to get her attacks off in the air, knowing that he's most likely going to block. So she gets to open him up because he is more than likely going to keep quiet and wait for her to come in, block, push her back out, and start over. This is another match where advantageous spacing is achieved by doing something that also happens to open the opponent up. A very useful thing for Ino. Her standing dust pushes Kai back to the point where even if he blocks it, her advantage is relatively sealed. He has to react because he's expecting the standing dust and cut her off before she can actually do it. This can be difficult enough that it's really just not worth his time, and he should try to work out how to deal with her without it. Mostly because Kai does have a lot of moves that do relatively well against the Rift like that, as demonstrated there. So it's not in Ino's best interest to use that move, except at very long ranges where she expects Kai to try to approach. namely not at the end of their normal block string interactions. Something else has to have happened, a dust knockback, a fireball, a big combo. At those moments, Ino has reason to believe that the Rift will actually do something. But when they've both been playing decent defense in the middle of the screen for a little bit, chances are that Kai will either anticipate or react to it quickly enough that it won't do anything. At that point, as demonstrated there, what she wants is actually the note. Because it covers so many more things that she can do, and is tempting to make Kai try to deal with the situation somehow. On the other hand, successful chains like that, where she's pushed him too far out to do any other move, she should just consider the dust as a free advantage. Do a small combo with no real damage benefit, but hit the standing dust so that Kai must walk backward, and you can deal with them from there. Similarly, if he walks backward too far and you use a different combo, you can get hit by crouching dust, which again doesn't really do a lot of damage, but sets up so many good situations for her that she doesn't care anymore. And in this case, buys enough time for victory. But Chip is back on the board, so let's return to discussing how to deal with this character. This move also does not do a ton of damage, but prevents Kai from being able to throw fireballs. And more or less prevents him from approaching either. He can't stick out buttons, he'll get punished by it, a bunch of other things. He also has a really high hitbox, so it deals with a lot of situations where Kai goes into the air to prevent himself from having trouble. Rift punishes all day. So, how does Kai defend against this? You would think that originally that his simplest answer would be to make sure that he is always on proper defense and further away from Chip. But the answer is actually that his offense can increase relative to most of the things he does. It's just that the way the offense increases is different. This is because there's a ton of stuff that Chip does that is actually whiff punishable with Greed Sever. And because so many of his other stuff can be just punished by directly Vapor Thrust, you really just have to treat him as a pinball and catch him all the time. The stuff that Chip is doing is generally much slower than you initially would think. And if your character's moves cover a lot of space, you can cover many of Chip's options at once and save yourself a lot of stress. Jumping straight up can also help you quite a lot in this matchup, because it minimizes the damage Chip actually does to you even when he hits. Kai is also one of the characters with the largest advantage against Alpha Blade in the game, namely that he can keep Chip from getting to the space where the distance Alpha Blade travels makes it unpunishable. However, obviously the cost of trying to do this is that you become vulnerable to Chip whiff punishes. It becomes a question of very active defense, of understanding how to not be in positions where Chip can do a lot of damage to you, and looking for your opportunities to convert into big damage of your own. Now as for Slayer, Slayer can suffer a lot in this matchup if he stands still for too long. This is because Slayer is extremely susceptible to this sort of thing. He has really nothing he can do against Chip from very far away, and his forward movement does not lead to him being able to get out of teleports without dashing. So it's simply a question of, is Chip standing far enough away to be dangerous to you or not? He gets none of his usual, I get to do what I want in neutral. Except if he dashes like that. When he does dash, he becomes extremely effective again. And because he is one of the characters who is best at locking Chip down once he gets a hit, moving around out of the way of Chip's situations and then winning any scramble changes the situation back in Slayer's favor. Chip also has terrible defense, leading to massive amounts of damage being done by Slayer's general setups. A little mobility from Slayer will set up a lot of situations in which Chip cannot land the follow-ups from his slash level teleport, and result in Slayer being able to counterattack. A general awareness of where Chip ends up and how long his teleport takes to work is mostly enough to set yourself up for good situations. Therefore, for most of this match, for Axel, it is a question of back or up back. That's all it is, really. If you can correctly decide which of those two things is important in any given moment, Chip's low defense takes care of the rest of the match for you. And once he's in that situation, just don't let him rest. The amount of damage that you take from Chip's uppercut on wake up is really not that concerning to you, and Axel doesn't have to stand close enough to worry about a lot of the things that move can do. As you can see, just one wake up attack will tear away most of Chip's health. Chip player's job, learn to block. But then Axel can do that. You have to be very fast on your reactions and wake ups to make sure that things don't turn strongly against you in this matchup. On the other hand, going for actual Oki is probably bad because if you miss the attack, Chip can whiff punish you from practically the whole screen. And there are certain weird interactions with hitboxes that allow him to do wake-ups on things that are meant to hit him directly from far that he cannot do if you delay it a little bit and actually wait for him to try to hit something that he could block. This matchup is similar to the Slayer one. Ino never really has to be where Chip wants her to be. Ever. And unlike Slayer, she gets to do a lot more attacks from that position. Since she's often not on the ground, she's also not particularly susceptible to his command grab. And since she has good normals in neutral, like Kai, she can prevent him from getting to the space where it's a good idea, while still recovering out of a ton of stuff, just naturally winning out. The startup of Alpha Blade is also not so good that an Ino on the attack will lose, sorry. If Ino has already started her attack and Chip decides it's time to do that, normally it doesn't work out in Chip's favor at all. Chip is actually almost safer playing the runaway style in this matchup, because Ino has a lot more trouble controlling her movement in terms of limiting it than most characters. This means that Chip gets a lot more potential situations for scrambles where his whiff punish buttons are equally effective. And because Ino can't react as quickly to stuff, she doesn't get to get away from things either. Chip's extremely high jump and multiple jump ability means that he can also stay out of the way of a lot of the things she generally wants to do to punish people for going into the air, forcing her to use slower effects and attacks, which open her up to a bunch of stuff. It becomes a very button-mashy matchup in which the attack vectors are more important than anything else. In short, Ino can't get through Shuriken. She can only attack forward, but as you can see, Chip can literally jump so high that if you time it right, even her normal attacks will normally go through things. And she has to spend a lot more time putting out stuff like that. It's functionally the same as Chip plays against other people on the ground, but the entire process occurs while in the air. They're playing air footsies, in short. And long-range air footsies is extremely complicated to watch, but relatively fun. And of course you can see that Chip is not as happy about it as I am. Once again, we are back to the Ino versus Kai matchup. Spacing, block strings, understanding what to do after your block strings, those sorts of things. still we go, from Ino's relatively high susceptibility to the high-low mix-up, as Kai's go to approach here. Ino's evasive hurt boxes on her approach, and the number of places she can stick out things in response to Kai doing something once she happened to jump at the right moment, or even just put out note really, help her to deal with said high-low mix-up, making sure that Kai cannot just do slide or greed sever for more or less the entire match once he's spaced correctly. Many of his other options become much less effective in this matchup than in most, and give Ino some space to actually get some stuff done. Since neither character normally in this matchup gets to convert into big combos, playing the neutral correctly should be your main focus. When you have learned some good combos off of Standing Dust and some good juggles off of very close greed sever, you may be able to expand your repertoire and get some stuff done. And when you've learned to roam and cancel correctly, of course. Whereas this matchup is mostly a matter of Ino's timing on her Oki, which is not so effective on other characters but tends to work well on Slayer because of his attack vectors. But just like everyone else, she is not really able to challenge Slayer at the end of his block strings and has to think more about how to use both her meter and her good options for staying out of his way when he follows it up. The move you see there that does evade some of Slayer's moves after the block string also loses quite hard to some other stuff he can do, making it a relatively hard read. Fortunately for Ino, once they are in neutral, Standing Dust tends to be effective. An offensive Slayer who dashes a lot more tends to be in more positions that can be dealt with, but Ino then gets to zone that player more often than not. Sol is actually a good character for showing off something that is not necessarily clear if you come from other fighting games. Before I mentioned that Chip has a very high jump. Well, if you look at it carefully, Sol has an extremely low jump. This means that in this matchup, part of the reason why it's suggested that Ino try to keep Sol in position is that he can't really jump out of very much. He's likely to get caught by a ton of her stuff, and she doesn't have to worry so much about him getting over her note attack, leaving her much more free to launch it in more situations. He simply doesn't have the vertical to deal with a lot of her stuff. But without recognizing that there is a difference in between whether or not characters can get away from your moves based on how high they normally jump, you wouldn't necessarily be able to come up with that approach to the matchup. Knowing that he will also tend to be low in the air and unable to cross you up even when he does it normally means that she can use her anti-air normals for a lot of things. Making defense against Sol relatively easy for Ino as a whole. She just doesn't have to deal with a lot of things that she has to deal with against other characters with better cross-up. She has to deal with a lot more frontal attacks, leaving her free to use the Rift to do a lot of things. The difficulty is that she can't stay on the ground to do it. He has just enough height that grounded Rift will not be enough. So to keep him under control requires at least enough execution that when you are close you can do air instant. It doesn't even have to be instant. Near instant air Rift, and it will be able to keep him out of nearly everything he does. If you get really good at it, I believe the hitbox is such that he has no vectors that will get through it. And now we're dealing with the other style of Axel. The one who sticks out lighter buttons from closer as a defensive strategy. This is actually slightly more effective against Ino because it's basically playing in the whiff punish style. And for Axel, Ino is actually fairly easy to whiff punish. It's just that you're taking much higher risks of her getting to you and opening you up than with the other Axel stuff. However, since she doesn't naturally do that much damage to Axel when she does convert off those tiny hits, he doesn't have to worry too much about choosing this style against her. Except when the Ino player then starts to be the zoner. This therefore is more of a matter of understanding your opponent's playstyle than anything else. Against this type of Axel, Ino's zoning strengths come in. Because Axel doesn't really have a way to move forward against her that is safe enough. And the player's instincts are likely to cause her to get some early damage from note or unexpected attacks in neutral. Meaning that once she has that, she can just basically get out of the space and zone them out. Since this is generally a less popular style of Axel, one generally doesn't find this matchup being played in this way. This is particularly so because Ino has to zone fully, like spend a lot more time at nearly max screen throwing out notes in one way or another, where Axel's moves can be forced to whiff. And using the amount of time on the hit stun of a fully hitting note to get any offense she wants. When she gets the knockdown, she can go back out and try again. Axel's options in those situations change back to the normal space control zoning style of Axel, but that style involves knowing when to advance, having very measured play, and understanding how to get through other people's zoning which is a lot harder for the style of Axel that you just saw. As you can see at that max range, Ino can at least safely do her Rift attack. She can almost always block before Kai can do anything else, and he can't move forward. This means that she's free to then decide, am I throwing out a note now or am I trying to go in, based on what I think the Kai will do. Kai can then use his meter to deal with the situation, but Ino can equally use her meter, especially following a note in, to set Kai up for bad things. Once they're back to that mid-style range though, the high-low mix-up available to Kai puts Ino at enough disadvantage that she doesn't really want to have to deal with it. Getting back out is mostly her priority, since Kai doesn't really have all that many attacks that will reach her all the way there. Going in is usually from a range where Kai could react to practically anything she did and get a situation as such as what you've just seen. In short, Ino loses in that situation when Kai is trying to zone her out and starts the attack to keep her quiet early, and she still tries to go in anyway. But her ability to defend and often just jump over a lot of his pressure means he has to spend a lot of energy on setting up things just to get close to her, and risking her to simply just block more. As you can see, that didn't actually convert to very much. Depending on what was available to her in terms of resources, and the spacing Kai is at, she can blitz through a lot of that as well. But with the guts, Kai goes for the slide after and does not get hurt by any of Ino's footsie buttons this time. The true desperation move. Slayer also suffers relatively heavily against Ino's note when they don't play in the dashing style. Especially since Ino can generally launch note from the air rather than trying to counterattack any other way. Depending on her spacing, this can be either an annoyance to Slayer or a huge problem. Even though he will not often get hit by the note, it will often cause his attacks to whiff in ways that leave her at advantage when she's the scramble starting. Luring the opponent into coming forward in those situations opens them up to get hit by her super, which actually has a fairly long range when around. Similarly, she can just come back down rather than actually launching the note, and sometimes hit him with a well-timed horizontal rift. Playing defense in this matchup is relatively easy if she is willing to push on him at the right times. Her bigger problem comes when she's not playing footsies in the cleanest way, namely hitting her standing buttons, and expects to be able to keep him out by using specials and other things. As you can see, Ino's standing kick is a devastatingly strong footsie button, against Slayer particularly, but in general, it's not really something that most people can deal with per se. They can certainly avoid taking any damage, but they can't necessarily get to the space they want to be in, as long as she's willing to hit it. However, Slayer can always dash through it, as he can dash through nearly anything, and make her miserable from there. Her ability to control her aerial spacing and keep herself from being clipped by a bunch of his stuff is the main advantage she gains in this matchup. So once again, Sol is a matter of understanding when note is enough and understanding when air riff, instant or otherwise, is what's required. Sol, however, is at least relentless enough that Ino can't make sure he stays out entirely. What she can do is damage him more than he manages to damage her in the process. So if your Sol player's defense and patience is good enough, you won't get that much out of this. However, he will use a lot more meter than she will, and understanding how to maximize that to her advantage is basically how this matchup is decided. If Ino can use her meter to get damage and counteract Sol's approaches, she can often win it, and if not, Sol uses up his meter more effectively, and despite the match seeming even, Sol just wins on damage after a while. In those situations where Ino does lose control of the neutral like that, it's relatively easy to get it back. But once again, unless she can use that meter effectively, Sol will just win off damage eventually. The execution and mental awareness level required for both players in that matchup gets rather high. Sol must not only respond to Ino throwing the note out, but which direction she probably sent it in. Sometimes he can get under it, sometimes he can get over it, and sometimes he can ignore it or punch it. But being ready to do that is much more important for that matchup than most other zoner style play. But we are back to Axel. We're back to a zonable Axel. Note how much time the note buys for Ino when she hits him, even when he blocks it. Axel's entire strength is generally that he cannot easily be approached because the opponent has to go through this gauntlet of normals. But if he's blocking, obviously he can't throw out his gauntlet of normals in the first place. Timing your approach with him blocking means that he basically can't keep you up. He can block it. And her mix-ups are not that good. But he's not that effective against Ino when she gets close in the first place. She has to overcommit most of the time for this to become a problem. The Axel player has the option of trying to clip her even before it starts. Or, obviously, as you've seen there, just jump over the note. But not only does she have the capacity to slow down enough to control it properly, she can often make sure that even if he responds, the flinch reaction will cause him to occasionally take some damage, and her footsie buttons will handle the rest. This works on both styles of Axel. It's just that the other is more likely to convert into good damage earlier and make the situation negative for her. The other style of Axel is also more capable of measuring distance and going forward, so you don't have to worry as much about the note in the first place. Understanding also that unless the opponent is very carefully watching how the note is hitting them, it actually has a confusing enough animation that it can mask one or two of Aino's attacks. It's not something that you should expect most high-level players to have problems seeing through. But given that she's safe anyway, and it has weird block stun, you can get some good mix-ups off this. Just thinking about how to deal with it can solve your problem. Kai has a much easier time against this particular style of Axel. However, there is a large advantage that this form of Axel gets over Kai that is seen in the player's playstyle directly. Kai is much more likely to get hit by raw Rashosen. Since this style of player is not measuring as much, the opposing player gets a much more heavy feel for what they supposedly could do. It's just that this feeling is often wrong. Often, we are used to Axel being a character who sticks out long buttons and you get to go in on him afterwards. But if you stick out less committed buttons, the opponent may easily have the same reaction. They may still go for a counterattack before it's time to do that, allowing the raw Rashosen to buy you some time and get some damage in. As you can see, it's more likely to make your opponent hesitate in neutral and allow you to set up scrambles. So it is much easier for this style of player to just respond to you getting close to them instead of actually hitting Axel buttons, let you get close enough and then grab you with the chains. The other helpful thing I've seen there is, because it's no longer a matter of reacting from very far away, and therefore responding in time to get a good long attack, the opponent is likely to have to think very quickly on their feet as to what combo they can actually do if they instant air dash over that. Are they close enough to do a standard upward jump and then do it? Do they have the instant dash? Do they get to throw out attacks? For many characters, this is really not that much of a problem. They'll just jump and instantly do something, usually a downward attack. But Kai doesn't have a lot of good options for this, leaving him in the space where jumping over it is just not that useful. Now that Axel's crouch heavy is cancelable, the same thing tends to happen just at longer ranges as well. But Axel has always been able to force that sort of behavior from Kai by playing in this style rather than the other. The matchup between Slayer and this style of Axel tends to be relatively binary if Slayer is not dashing. Rashosen will catch nearly everything Slayer can do from a certain range, and outside of that range, then Rensen and Crouch Heavy will also do the rest of the job. So it's really just a question of how far away is Slayer, which of these two things do I need to do? Until Slayer gets close enough to put on pressure, neither of those is really risking anything because Slayer, like Kai, does not have a good, at least not a particularly good, leap into air and come down attack. Therefore, Axel, while he can definitely have the problem of Slayer getting in on him if he guesses wrong, he's not likely to get hurt. And he does have some good counters and reversals that can prevent Slayer from staying in long enough for this to matter. Burst will generally do the rest for Axel. Under a bad situation where it has finally come to the point where Slayer is actually managed to get in and started a good combo, the amount of time that normally takes within this matchup means that Axel normally only needs to use his burst once to reset the whole thing and put Slayer back into a position where he has to do it all over again. And there we see Axel's strongest weapons against Ino throwing out milk. But as noted before, that forces Axel back into the very zony style that Ino is good at getting in on. Knowing when the player has switched from one to the other is good for you overall. But it's just a matter of understanding it enough to switch your mindset. Axel can keep Ino out when he isn't trying to use his long attacks and is generally reacting. Ino can use the note to force him to use those long attacks and therefore let her get in at times when she's not using it. Once she is in though and manages to either get a good attack going or a knockdown, generally staying close will lead to this style of Axel bullying her with normals until she is clear of him again. One other thing that Ino can do very well in this matchup is actually use her burst offensively. After getting in with a note, it's very likely that Axel is going to try something. And Ino can just burst herself when close to him. It does not always break his defense and obviously is punishable, but depending on your situation, you might not care enough. The benefit to her from just doing burst in those situations where she expects to need to get back out is far too high to justify anything else. In short, Ino is free to use burst as a retreat tool with the knowledge that whatever Axel does is most likely not going to be that dangerous to her for doing it. But here we have her sitting on the life lead and basically has already won if she doesn't go into her. And one note to the toe ends the match.
まだ役に入りきらないのテヌートが売りなのね。でもちょっと長すぎるわ。何事も程度が重要なの。
So in this matchup, Axel also wants to use his standing dust in this style. But of course, as with all styles, there's a slightly different timing for the use of said standing dust. Kai's general problem is not that he doesn't want to walk away, it's that in scrambles, he doesn't know what to do. But just like Ino, as you've noted, Axel's standing dust at the right range pushes Kai to a position where Axel has advantage again. And it solves so many problems that other longer buttons normally need to be used for, that it's relatively safe to do it. Kai's good options are to walk backward, which then give Axel positional and let him measure the space without having to do anything. He can be on defense and still have this setup. It also allows him to get that sort of, let's call it a mix-up, even though it isn't really one, where Kai does not know if Axel is going to advance and move to try to get to the other side of him. This forces Kai to keep up the offense a lot more and makes Axel's reversals and supers more likely to be effective. It also obviously opens the Kai player up to more crouch heavy from Axel, because while the move is slow enough that you generally would be responding, when as a mix-up at that range with Dust, it's not so easy to do. This, as you just saw, increases the amount of times Axel can safely get out of the corner, which is where Kai gets his real pressure against his character. Similarly to Ino, the burst eventually buys him enough time that he doesn't have to worry about too much. Unfortunately, most of Axel's normals don't push back enough, well, the ones used in this style, don't push back enough other than the standing dust to get any good advantage on Kai, and you constantly have to be working to deal with the high-low mix-up that Kai is able to do.
Get up to rock, get up to burn, stand with the pride, ever feel your desire. お待たせ。恨みこなした。デュエル、ワン、やったー。おっしゃ。遊びのよ。
Axel's strong ability to respond to Slayer's pressury things with his counter is a relatively hard read or gambit, but it does help because it causes Slayer to have to hesitate on attacks that would otherwise be how he gets his space advantage. That space advantage is not necessarily the most important thing in the matchup, but at certain spaces in the stage, it becomes important for Axel to try to hold on to it for just a bit longer. Of course, one shouldn't generally be too predictable with it, but you should generally expect that after a while, the player will use the counter or at least threaten it so that the Slayer player has to hesitate, and therefore Axel gets to hold a little more space. It is similar to how Ino can deal with a lot of Slayer stuff at certain ranges by hitting Rip quickly enough that he can't get in. She can't do this once she has taken damage, but just expecting him to move, she can generally flip it up. This is because the Rip avoids a lot of attacks that would otherwise clip her, and getting through it mostly requires you to be willing to deal with her lows. As you can see, the final piece of the puzzle is her standing kick, which blocks out a lot of Slayer's approach vectors and even anti-airs a lot of the things he does. It is also quick enough that she can often block if he tries to do something on reaction to seeing it. But this may not always help, because once he has caused you to block, at least he's in and you have to deal with all of it. Therefore, it's important for her to recognize when her neuter needs to be used to reset a situation she is otherwise being stressed by. Ino's relatively strong attacks from the air combined with Slayer's relatively weak offensive vectors in that direction are the final piece, allowing her to stay out of the way of a lot of his pressure when she's already blocking with lows by just jumping rather than doing anything on the ground. While Slayer can hit her, especially if she has burst, it's not going to lead to much, and if she does things related to super or going up by just dashing in certain cases, there's not much that will make a lot of disadvantage for her. She will get hit sometimes, Slayer will build up some momentum, but Unless he can convert into the knockdown, which can only be done off 2 moves normally, it's not too difficult to deal with him from there. Once again, as always, note the sheer advantage attained by Ino by Kai actually blocking that move. He has a couple options, but none of them are actually good compared to hers, that is. But there we see him manage to get barely over it. And it looks like it's going to be a stressful ending to this. Here it is. That brings us to our last match of the night. One more Axel versus Ino. Therefore, goodbye Tuesday train. Stop by tomorrow for some general thoughts about Falk in Street Fighter V and the concepts that are likely to go into the Falk bot. And on Thursday for Dragon Ball FighterZ, Kame House Beginner Lobby. By Friday, we should actually have some more development done, but it's most likely that Friday's stream may not be Street Fighter at all. Expect content from some other game for once, as we've just released a kata and expect to release a bot at the end of next week. So I expect probably a short stream, but we'll most likely be hosting the Traveling Controller stream at the end of that, and you can watch the action from Balance Patch. Assuming they have their stream up this week. Next Monday is, of course, another Street Fighter Lounge. Will not be out yet, and therefore most likely just standard mishmashing. And Tuesday should, as always, be another Tuesday train. As always, feel free to join us, especially if you play a character that's not actually seen, or if you need practice with such a character based on anything I've said, any of the characters we do play. You can come and test out your understanding of the matchup, and maybe teach us some things about what we should be incorporating, one way or the other. And once again, from the entire team and all guests that have stopped by to date, we hope that your practice goes well and you remember all the parts of your matchups. For our standard Street Fighter bot content, head over to 2-mk.org. And to keep track of what we're doing, our Twitter is 2_mk_FGC. This has been Rillian for the team. Good night, everyone. That's a wrap.